from bare earth and sticks to an exuberant fairy tale cottage garden. I've worked this postage stamp patch of ground for the past 17 years, and I'm still amazed at its seasonal transformation. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you know that this is where it all started. And even though I've since crafted a cottage garden of my own, I still return to cultivate this one for my mother. Let's see how it changed this past season, while I share gardening tips and design ideas to improve the space and deal with old and new challenges of the original suburban homestead. In this video, we'll focus on the front portion of the yard. There are surprises brewing on the side and backyard. That is to be discovered in future videos, if there is enough interest from you all, so let me know below. It's the sunniest spot in the property, so we decided to fill it with flowers, turning a once utilitarian veggie garden into a dreamy space chock full of ornamentals. But if there's one thing that this space lacks, is winter interest, a fact I am reminded each year come early spring. Everything is very bare at this moment, covered by grass clippings. This image will soon change as I start getting all the additional perennials and many of the annuals planted. A few tulips herald the arrival of spring, but that could be enhanced in the future. The tulips, some are blooming, some are budding out. They are multiplying and gaining strength. The bed itself is higher, and for you to be successful growing more of these plants, you do need to be careful when they're in their summer slumber. They can't be in soggy soil that will cause the bulbs to rot. I'd rather have tulips that always return, so if I find the varieties that are stronger, that increase in size, then it makes sense because then it's trouble-free and maintenance-free. When I first envisioned this garden, I wanted to have some manicured box bushes as evergreen structures. At that time, with the shoestring budget of a high schooler, I only got one box bush in hopes of propagating it further. Eventually, the garden just shaped itself. And other perennials like the crepe myrtle tree and the blueberry bushes provided enough structure for the warm season to make hedges impractical. I could decide to incorporate a few box bushes in strategic spots to give a bit more formality to the garden during winter. But when I see the summertime effect of the space, I forget about that. Maybe you'll agree with me. Well, actually, I am more interested in the flowering plants and the expectation of seeing their display materialize out of nothing. So the bare months never bother me too much, frankly. Hollyhocks are amongst the flowers that I've really been trying to grow here, but it's been a disappointment, mainly because of animal attacks and disease. One thing I'm really looking forward to this year is the hollyhock that's growing here, protected from the groundhog, rabbits, and my goal is to make more of these structures made out of conduit to protect the plants and also support them. That will be my first successful hollyhock, the quintessential cottage garden flower. Supposedly there are enchanted corners of cottagecore land where these grow like weeds, but Maryland never got the memo from the Department of Cottage and Scenic Affairs. By early May, a wave of bright blooms adorned the entrance. We're getting into the second wave of blooms in spring. Everything is covered by small droplets of water. This area flanking the main path was where I first planted perennial ornamentals. It has hosted a few different plants over the years, including butterfly bush and black-eyed Susan. Ever since the crepe myrtle grew bigger and cast more of shadow, I've been trying to find new annual and perennial plants that can thrive in these conditions, so I experiment each year. Still working on cleaning up this side here. I'm putting some annuals. There's Agerantum, Agrostema, Cosmos, some larkspurs. Let's see how well they establish and if they bloom. The oriental poppies popped out on the other side of the road years ago, likely from an old forgotten garden. I took some of the shoots and replanted them here. They flourished especially while the crepe myrtle was still developing, casting less shadow over them. They've ebbed and flowed since then, but they have been quite dependable overall. They're a little bit more sparse and I feel like I need to clean around them. There's a lot of ground ivy that's taken hold and some sticky lily. Bearded iris is one of the mainstay reliable flowers on this path. Recently, they have been feeling the reduction in light, so I am at risk of losing them in the future as they have shown signs of weakness. I should invest in getting more, or definitely worth their weight in the garden, but I always end up forgetting. Since the beginning, I wanted this entrance bed to hold ornamentals, so I planted azaleas to provide a shrubby backdrop, except they took ages to grow to size. To be frank, I think azaleas, they might be too garish with their colors, but the white one is okay. And this one has a specific habit that's a little bit more leggy, which I think actually looks better. But look at how nicely it looks with the neighbor's house. Very dreamy. I think one of the main problems with azaleas is that they create a big clump of bright color that doesn't connect much around it. If the blooms were spaced farther apart from each other, the effect would be more interesting. That's why I considered their cousins, rhododendrons, more beautiful, but they wouldn't quite fit here. So, would I choose azaleas now? Probably not. But will I take them off? Probably not, because they took a decade to get to this size. This second display of blooms in early May helps give flesh to the once spindly space. But I could look into other easy perennials that flower at this time to complete the picture. If you have any good plant suggestions, please tell me below. Preferably ones that groundhogs don't like to eat. If we ever wanted to make the space better designed without worrying about budget or feasibility, I would make some drastic changes to the hardscape. I would rip up the main path and porch floor to create a seamless surface of brick or stone with curves on the corners for an inviting design. This would greatly improve the bones in this main part of the garden, a better flowing design overall. But part of me likes to work with less than ideal hardscape because it challenges me to use plants as the main building blocks. You can only have a cottage garden in spirit if it blooms out of less than ideal conditions and you don't spend a pretty penny on it. Another resourceful hallmark of a true cottage garden is to include edibles everywhere possible. In May, the warmer temperatures and ample rain caused all the dry twigs to leaf out, including the blueberry bushes and the grapevines that create the walls to the garden. If blueberries were evergreen, they would be the perfect bush for edible landscaping, but they are still glorious in all other stages of growth, both in bloom and also in fall colors. Blueberries, they look a little bit more sparse this year after what happened with the cicadas. I think they took a hit and they were heavily laden last year, so that could be part of the reason. Grapevines were the first thing I planted in this garden against this fence. I think the vines are beautiful, especially in early summer, but most of their fruit ends up getting black spot, despite this being the sunniest and most ventilated spot in the garden. This year I finally decided to spray the copper solution in the grapes, the so-called Bordeaux mixture. It is an organic fungicide, but even without a great harvest, the grapes do provide a welcome separation from the street, giving a sense of enclosure. I could replace them with some other ornamental vine that thrives here, perhaps clematis, but I'm not sure. As the colorful blooms of early May fade, towards the end of the month, the garden goes through an ugly duckling phase as it prepares itself for the full metamorphosis of summer. I've prepared the scene for the next big growth period. That's when the major plantings of high summer will take place. I've cut down the tulips that they were already getting yellow and dried, and I've planted several annuals and a few perennials. It's always a surprise because sometimes you think a plant is going to do absolutely well and it flounders, and something you didn't give much faith just surprises you. Several of the main perennial blooms put all their vigor first in their leaf. They grow at a frenetic pace. The lush greens draw the attention of rabbits. I try to plant seedlings faster than they can munch on things, but inevitably I lose. The hollyhocks, they look amazing, and I'm really having to overprotect them because the rabbits are the ones that are really trying to eat them. There was a small shoot that started to grow here and it's just eaten away by the rabbit, whereas the protected one is fine. If it blooms, I'm gonna rejoice. There's no major disease especially. At this point, the garden is more a symphony of greens, several different types of greens and textures, but soon enough, I hope to see lots more blooms. Late May is the perfect time to have rose blossoms. If I wanted to bridge the second act of the garden to the main act, I would plant more roses. I did back in the day, but I was disappointed since they tend to get infested by black spot. This rose is really a stubborn survivor who laid claim to the space. It is the rootstock of a cheap bare root rose I bought once that eventually died from black spot fungus. I have tried to kill this wilder rambler, but it always pops up from its deep underground root reserves. My mother loves the color, reminding her of childhood blooms, so we decided to let it grow. And I cannot deny its effect is glorious, even as it only flowers once a year. I prefer roses that flower repeatedly. Perhaps I should plant more bushes. I have grown the disease-resistant knockout series in the back secret garden, but I'll only show more of the space if you really want to see it. By early June, I started to understand why many of my ground-hugging seedlings were not growing as abundantly as I would have hoped. There was a nest of rabbits here that kind of delayed things by nibbling on and uprooting things. There was a litter of bunnies You saw the mom scurrying away. I suppose the young one doesn't have fear of humans, as you can see, which makes it very vulnerable to other predators. They were living here. This is the nest. I only realized a few days ago. Oh well, it's quite cute though. And if you want a proper cottage garden, you do have to have proper cottage creatures. Besides the rabbits, the garden was also hosting another new family. Cardinals had built a nest on the tree. Then, all of a sudden in June, color arrives to the garden in full force. It grows weekly in a crescendo as waves of bloom succeed each other. The center portion of this garden, which became a sort of secluded garden chamber, serves as the focal point. Two old plant towers that we painted sky blue accentuate the space, drawing the eye to the center of the composition. The overall layout of this garden has emerged over time. I didn't have much of a plan when I began, and it shows, as it just follows the pre-existing squarish lines of the space. Today the garden is looking particularly English since it's raining. I've come to really love rainy mornings in the garden when the flowers tumble a bit because of the rain. It's also kind of magical. I like the separation from the street the space gives. Having a garden display that prioritizes the street view would be less exciting here, in my opinion, especially since the property has a slight decline in elevation compared to the road. But in these cases, playing with imagination by creating these semi-private rooms makes the space much more memorable. When the home is uphill and there is enough land, making a picturesque view from the road makes sense. Of course, I could have spent a lot of money with hardscape to design a garden that would be half elevated, half sunk, creating a roadside display and a secluded front garden room facing the porch by using a berm or raised beds. Yet, I still think the overall space proportioning is successful. Perhaps with the path I showed earlier, coupled with a circular center bed around a fountain maybe, and a more substantial old world wrought iron fence, this space would be elevated. Still, I'm not disappointed by the effect that plants alone can provide. The good thing is that I can always change things each year and experiment. Plants can serve as columns like the hollyhocks, lacy screens, walls, etc. I wanted to show you the case of the cardinals that have nested on the crepe myrtle tree, because I've seen activity and I believe the eggs have hatched. Part of the fun of gardening is discovering where each plant thrives with minimal care and shifting the plan accordingly. Ultimately, this is the main guiding principle of cottage gardening. I have here one of the lilies that used to bloom, but slowly they've diminished. I just know that this side here has gotten shadier and shadier because of the crepe myrtle tree. The lilies loved this area, and I should frankly plant more of them. Look at how beautiful this is. This is a great cosmos. I think its form and the way that the flowers are shaped is amazing. We have basket flower here. That's a new plant. I wasn't sure how interesting it would be, but looking at it in person, I like the height. Let's see how long it flowers for. You know you've gotten it right when you turn around one day and you see a scene worthy of a tin of biscuits. But not all is well and idyllic. Reality has a way of waking us up. Grapes have developed a disease despite all my efforts. I'm only hoping that there might be more fruit than usually, but it seems like the copper spray is a complete wash. We had most of the black-eyed Susans not come up. The disease has gotten to them, as I talked about last time. But the few that have come up, they have been eaten by rabbits, so... But that's the beauty of a cottage garden, is how it transforms. Let me deadhead this. The beauty of a cottage garden is precisely how it transforms from year to year, how things change, and they're really in flux. This corner is turning out nicely, finally. Hopefully the sweet alyssum will fill in. It's taking its sweet time. It is also fun to see how at times certain colors dominate. While we can plan for these shifts, if we really want to, I like to first discover the synchronicities that naturally appear and build on them. The hollyhocks look especially nice this morning, with the sun shining through them. The reddish dark color is popping, and it's harmonizing with the other lilies. This year, I noticed that at first I had white dominating, followed by deep reds and burgundies. Then a wave of yellows and orange yellows became the unifying elements with the help of the cosmos and zinnias. The yellows and oranges are finally harmonizing, and it's partially because of these tertiary bridge colors like the zinnia here. It might not be as impactful much as the super bright hues, but it provides that mixing that the eye so much needs to read a cohesive image. I still had a lot of whites like the glorious basket flower, but slowly the palette turns towards pink with the vibrant magenta of Tigridia and the softer pinks of the gladiolas. And here in the entrance, we have the blooming pink plants that come a little bit later, the gladioli and the lilies. There's this new one, Tigridia. It only flowers for a few hours, even though it's a really nice plant. That kind of makes me think that it's not one of the best options. I like flowers that flower at least for a few days so that we can count on them being there. I achieve a more cohesive color palette by excluding certain tones without overanalyzing everything. For this garden, I just tend to choose plants that are pink or go well with the cooler pinks, while in my house, I actually don't use much pink, opting for reds and oranges and yellows. Just look how awesome this potpourri of muddied yellows and scarlets and purples. The good thing about color schemes is that you can cycle through them, which is something you can't do in an image, but you can do in a garden. And I have to say the blue of the towers make absolute sense with the oranges. And then the pink kind of pushes it, so it's not just complementary colors. They're kind of coolish pinks. That's why they work so well with the blue. I think this was a fortunate, happy accident. Back in the shady corner, I was making a few valuable plant discoveries. Feverfew. Gotta plant more of it. Definitely gonna save the seeds. And calla lilies? My world just expanded. I was resisted planting them, thinking they were gonna be fussy. They're absolutely majestic and easy. As July rolls by, bountiful blooms hide less welcome developments like persistent disease. Unfortunately, the hollyhock, even though it was beautiful, it's gotten rust. That means its days are numbered. I'm very much saddened by this one, especially because it was looking very strong, and this was supposed to be the rugosa type, which is supposed to be rust resistant. I don't think it is. By late July, the garden reaches its peak with a profusion of pink. Loud lilies and soft gladioli form an impromptu parade that make us forget all the other plans we may have had for the space. Could we dare design anything more beautiful? It's the middle of July, and I think the garden has reached its peak. From now on, it might be downhill. That means there's some glorious developments. We did get some Queen Anne's lace to finally bloom. They're looking spectacular in this corner. It's very much a potpourri of color. Love the zinnias, bringing in all the colors and tying them together. Dahlias will continue blooming, but most of the bigger blooms, like the lilies, are done for the season. Over in the corner, we have the hydrangea that bloomed much better. The crepe myrtle tree, a few days or weeks, it's gonna be glorious. This looks like also a proper cottage garden in the small scale. This entrance, it's not perhaps as colorful as last year. I have used more white flowers, and the azarina vine, which is also white colored, will be covering the space, and we're gonna have the zinnias taking over. Future years, Beatrice is just gonna be fuller. These cosmos, they were wonderful some time ago. Now they've diminished and they're putting out seeds, and I've been just throwing out the seeds willy-nilly, and maybe they'll grow later on. And this area here is looking a little bit more ratty than it was a few weeks ago, but that's just the natural way that the cottage garden changes. There's way too much morning glory, and some of the morning glory is actually the blue kind that I don't want, so I might have to go over and kill some of the vines. Just have to keep up on cutting it back and laying it to rest. Ideally, I should have other plants to take their place, but you know, it's always hard to keep on track of everything you want to do in the garden. Still, you can see that these asters are just phenomenal. Even if you have a few, they're wonderful plants. You know, I just wonder, Before photos, we could only enjoy this spectacle of nature at the height of summer. Nowhere else could one find such dazzling sculptures of color and light. The fugitive nature only added to the mystique. Growing a garden was the only way of glimpsing paradise. Fleeting. We're getting to the beginning of August, and we see that the eggplant here has been producing lots of beautiful white eggplants. But the garden is getting ready for its main attraction, which is the crepe myrtle tree. It's already looking phenomenal. It's almost serving as a tunnel this time. Has grown maybe a little bit too big. That means that this year I have to trim it later. It's interesting to see the neighbor's crepe myrtle in the distance also kind of ties everything together. Here's what this garden is all about. This portal into a secret place. And when you walk in the street, you see little glimpses if you peer through, but only when you get in is where you experience the garden for what it is. Just like in a finale for a musical, the tempo of the garden slows down and the festively dressed blooms descend a grand staircase of branches that materialized out of nowhere from backstage. This is how I see the blooming of the crepe myrtle for this garden. Soon, autumn's curtain call will end the show, but for one last time, the garden pulls all stops and mesmerizes. While we may love the show, the real audience is a swarm of bees drinking to their heart's delight. We cannot deny the glory of this crepe myrtle tree. But when it comes to bucolic scenes, I think this takes the cake. After last night's rainstorm, the crepe myrtle looks particularly pendulous. It gives a nice effect, even if less practical. But it also means I'll have to trim it for sure. You can find little windows and holes to frame out the secret garden room. If you're inspired and want to start your own wilder cottage garden, there are a few things to consider before you break ground. And you know what? Maryland has a very congenial climate for this type of gardening. It's not going to work everywhere. Definitely it's not going to work in the West. Plants need constant moisture to bloom like this. And also there's the question of snakes. I'm sure that people who live in the West are accustomed to dealing with much more serious snakes. If we do find snakes, they're usually the garter type or the black rat snake, which is actually a beneficial one to have because it controls the rodent populations. I imagine that England didn't have serious snakes either, and that's why it's been able to develop this style of gardening, because it's a primal fear of many people, and it's a concern if you have so many plants like this, because at this time I go through the garden, I'm not really seeing where I'm stepping. But one thing I've noticed for those who are afraid of snakes, the years that I've spent the most time in the garden, the less snakes I see. It seems like they don't like human presence as much. While summer is always a visual feast, as plants grow old, the garden gains an unruly tone as Eden sinks to grief. The garden has fallen a bit on disgraced pear and overgrowth, as it's common in this time of the year, but I feel like it's this fading glory of this time that makes it also be a special time. The asters are dominating this point. I always feel like I never plant enough of them. They're quite the glorious daisies. Keeping up with the growth in this late stage is a bit complicated. I do know that from now on, it's going to be worse and worse. Look at this morning glory. This is when it shines. I must say, I do love this variety. This corner is quite the spectacle at this moment with all the color and its wild character. The blue and pink really shine. This is the uglier stage as the season winds down. There's still some flowers here and there, but there's a lot of dying plants and branches. Of course, the dahlias are the thing that will keep up some flowering, but it's still kind of a messy, wild cottage garden that has its charm. It may not be the perfect time of the year for the garden in terms of plants, but in terms of light, September does bring out its A game. And with one final scintillating sigh of dahlia blossoms, the garden is laid to rest. Next year, we may try new ideas, but some will remain but a dream. I hope you were inspired by this video. I would like to thank everyone who has supported the channel by purchasing art from my Etsy shop. This painting actually is for sale, as is this other one and some other new ones that I'll be putting in the future. Everyone who has purchased art has helped make new videos possible, and it made all the difference for quality videos that I've been able to spend hours producing. So thank you very much, and see you next time.